Jesus is doing something new and radical with his church, and he wants us all to be part of it.
Easter Day is the centre point of the whole of human history. The world before this day looked for it. The prophets pointed the way to this day.
Teachers and parents tell us, pay attention. And there's something in that because attention costs us something.
We orientate our lives around the celebration of Easter because it is a proclamation of our salvation.
Hello and welcome to this, the fourth season of Invited. These sessions are designed to be a part of our Lenten preparations, helping us all to make ready our hearts and our minds for the great liturgical celebration we'll be participating in a few weeks' time. We're coming to you again from Arundel Cathedral, the diocesan cathedral, to help keep our faith rooted in the local and the universal church. In our last season, during Advent, we looked at the person of Jesus Christ. Who is he to me? Who is he to you? We went on a journey looking at the fact that he is God, which requires a response from us. We explored our innate longing for God, the joy that he can bring us, no matter what the circumstances of life are, and began to really understand how we can make space for him in our homes and our hearts and every aspect of our lives. This season, our focus is the fact that we are not alone in our faith journey. Jesus founded the Catholic Church with all its glorious richness. Over the coming weeks, we will explore some of the opportunities available to us that will help us to grow in holiness. We begin today with Father Toby. Father Toby is a Dominican friar and priest. He was a lawyer for 7 years before deciding that the city was not for him and wanting to don the white habit. Since joining the Dominicans, he has studied in Cambridge, as well as Oxford and Rome. And more recently, he's worked as a university chaplain at KCL, a hospital chaplain during COVID, and he now works full-time as priest director of Radio Maria England. He loves reading. Long-distance pilgrimages on foot, his longest so far is 1,100 miles, old pubs, cricket, rugby and football. We are delighted to have him with us today as he shares his wisdom with us.
Viva Cristo Rey. This was the resounding battle cry of the Cristeros, the name given by the government to those Mexican rebels who refused to deny the name of Jesus Christ during a vicious persecution of Catholics in Mexico from 1926 to 1929, a war described by Graham Greene as the fiercest persecution of religion anywhere since the reign of Elizabeth. And on the subject of Graham Greene, if you want an amazing book to read, try His Power and the Glory. It made me cry, one of only 2 books I've cried during. But Viva Cristo Rey. This was the final confession on the lips of Blessed Miguel Pro, a martyr of the Cristeros War. He wasn't a resistance fighter as such, just a Catholic priest who, despite the threat of persecution, ran an underground ministry, teaching about God and bringing God to the people in the sacraments. In 1927, Father Miguel was falsely charged and sentenced to death without due trial for the attempted assassination of Mexico's former president, President Álvaro Obregón. But the reality was that he was simply arrested and killed for being nothing more than a faithful Catholic priest. Photographs of his execution were ordered by President Calles, and were intended to show the cowardly death of a Catholic priest. Ironically, though, what has been seared into the memory of Mexican Catholics is the very opposite of what Calles intended. The photographs immortalize an otherworldly truth. If you look them up and look at them, you'll see a man with all the self-possession, all the serenity that Jesus displays in his encounter with Pilate before his death. Both literally and figuratively, Father Miguel's life and death takes the form of a cross. With arms outstretched in cruciform fashion, rosary in one hand and a crucifix in the other, facing the firing squad with fierce and fearless serenity, Miguel Pro defied every worldly power. And it is said that he cried out in a clear and steady voice, "Viva Cristo Rey," just as the bullets riddled his body. After the publicity around the martyrdom of Blessed Miguel started to backfire, subsequent Mexican martyrs would have their tongues cut out before they were martyred for their faith, so that they could not cry out these words. But their sacrifice spoke the words all the same, and the words "Viva Cristo Rey" would not be silenced as brave Catholics broke the law to bury their martyrs. Even that had now been made illegal. And many Mexicans would line the streets for their funeral processions. And whilst you might silence one or two men or women, you cannot silence whole towns. And so they would shout out, "Viva Cristo Rey," as their dead passed by. At the end of their lives then, these martyrs had on their lips and hearts words that we might be tempted to translate as, "Long live Christ the King," but which don't actually mean that. Rather, "Viva Cristo Rey" is not the expression of a wish, such as when people cried out at the coronation of King Charles, "Long live the King." Rather, it's a statement of fact, a statement of faith. Christ the King, he lives. Christ the King lives. He has always lived, he will always live. He is Lord. But will I accept his Lordship? And what does that mean to accept the Lordship of God? Is it something I can just ignore? Well, no, just as the people who wear those shirts saying, "Not my president," and not stating a fact, but a wish. Either Christ is or is not God. And if he is, then my denial or ignoring of this does not change the fact. If Christ is King, the question becomes, how will I live? Will I live in accordance with this truth? And it's a real question because Jesus does not force it. Just as atheism could not be forced on the devout Mexican masses despite their slaughter by their own government, so faith cannot be forced without destroying the trust that lies at the heart of this relationship of faith. It's why it's wonderful that whatever place you are in with your faith right now, that you're watching this, and I'll try and make it worth your while. Faith, like love, must be free to be real. And faith, like love, also has to have real content to be true. To cry out "Viva Cristo Rey" is to speak a truth. But we are called not to simply say this, but to live the truth of this. Many have walked away from the church in recent years, some because they found the gospel too hard, but many others because they found the words of priests like me too hollow. The heart of our faith is that the Word became flesh. And that's supposed to be true, not just of Jesus, but of us too. Faith is not just belief, it's lived belief, belief made flesh. But the gospel is hard, and that's why Jesus got killed for preaching it, and it's why Christians still suffer for it today. Even simply refraining from gossip can be difficult for us. And there are lots of things that I notionally accept as true, but I don't really live the reality of. One might be, say, the need to combat climate change. And then you might think, do I actually try and meaningfully use less electricity? Do I actually suggest walking where we might normally drive? Don't settle for that gap always being there, But also don't stress too much about it, or rather, don't let it be the reason for quitting. Let it be the reason for accepting Christ. Because St. Paul knows our difficulty when he writes, "I do that which I do not wish to do." For most of us, there's a gap between who we want to be and who we are, what we want to do and what we do. Who has ever revised as much as they intended for their exams? Who gets to bed as early as they intended the night before a big day at work? And who had just one biscuit when they said to themselves, just the one? We find it hard to rule ourselves, let alone let Christ rule in our lives. But if we truly believe that Christ is King, we need to let him begin to rule in us, or our words will be, to quote St. Paul again, nothing more than a clashing cymbal. To be ruled by Christ is essential to the life of a Christian. One of the reasons we celebrate the great solemnity of Christ the King at the end of the liturgical year, just before the first Sunday in Advent, when a new year in the church begins, is to remind us that Jesus Christ is the end of our lives. That is, he is who and what we are aiming at, and the one who is supposed to give shape to our lives. And it's why we need to spend time with the scriptures. Our lives can't be shaped by what we do not know. And if we don't know Christ, if we don't meditate upon the things of Christ, then other things will give shape to our lives. And so I want to encourage you to keep choosing to know Jesus, and in knowing him to love him, because to know him is to love him, and then choose to follow him again and again and again, even as you fall again and again. Choose not to worship Jesus, even with the failures we have in following him, and you will end up worshipping something else instead. A favourite writer of mine, David Foster Wallace, makes this point in a brilliant university commencement address, often called "This is Water." I'd really recommend listening to it or reading it. And Foster Wallace says, there is no such thing as not worshipping. There are so many objects presented to us for worship each day that we often don't notice what we're doing. But there is no such thing as not worshipping. The reality is that we live in a society where you'll get mocked for worshipping Jesus, where people will tell you that worshipping Jesus enslaves you. They'll tell you that they're free and that you're not. And I think they couldn't be more wrong. Freedom is choosing to worship what is worthy of your worship, and not slipping unthinkingly into prioritizing what everybody else does. G.K. Chesterton said that even a dead fish can go with the flow. You have to be living to swim against it. And as David Foster Wallace says, in the lived reality of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And worship things other than God, and you'll find that unlike God who gives you life, these things will simply sap the life out of you. If you worship money and possessions, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. You'll always be able to see someone who's got more and want more. That's a truth. Worship your body and beauty and your sexual attractiveness, and you will always feel ugly and insecure. No amount of gym time or worse, surgeries or treatments will make you truly content, because you'll always be getting older, and you will just have to disfigure and distort yourself more and more. And then there will always be people younger and more beautiful than you who make you feel envious. Worship power and status, and you'll end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Worship your intellect, worship being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. But the worst thing, I think, about these other forms of worship is not so much that they're evil or sinful, it's that they're unconscious, they're unthinking, they are just default settings that we operate on. But thank God, by choosing to listen to this, you're already living more consciously than so many others. You're daring to be exposed to truths that will blow your mind, change your heart, transform your life. But as I said, if you don't choose to worship Jesus, it's not that you won't worship, it's just you'll slip into other forms of worship. And your world will get smaller and smaller. Algorithms online will probably get more and more selective about what you see, which will affect what you think is truly important. And the dangerous thing is all this can happen without you ever being fully aware that that's what you're doing. And more than likely, your life will become more defined by what you consume, what you buy, what you wear, what you watch, than it is by how good a husband, a wife, a friend, a father, a mother you are. And I know this is true because I've slipped down that road myself and I've seen it happen to friends. And you can get a long way down that road before you wake up, or worse, you might not wake up at all. Not loving Jesus won't make you open-minded like many will try to persuade you. More likely it will just make you more close-minded, only loving people in your own image who share your exact priorities. And look at how fiercely tribal the online world has become to see the truth of this. And the so-called real world will not discourage you from operating on your default settings, because the so-called real world of men and money and power doesn't want you to think. It wants you to watch, to click, to buy, and to go to work and to try and earn more so that the whole thing can repeat. Watch, click, buy. You might not use it like this, but if we're honest, much of what social media is about is the pursuit of likes and followers, the feeling that we're admired by others, desiring to be worshipped without any worry about being worshipped for being truly good. And if we live our lives online, we'll spend more and more time on appearing to be good than we will on becoming good. And we won't actually end up doing very much. People might tell you that religion is like a trap, that if you want to be free, you need to be able to do whatever you want, whenever you want. But I'd ask them, I'd ask you, what do you mean by being free? There are all different kinds of freedom, and the kind that is most precious, you will not hear much talk about in the great outside world of wanting and achieving and consuming. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline, and being able to truly care about other people and to sacrifice for them over and over again in unglamorous ways every day. You can become free to become a person who can be a good friend, a good parent, by learning not to do certain things just because you feel like them. You can be free to eat whatever you like, whenever you like, watch whatever you want, whenever you want, drink whatever you want, whenever you want. But you can't then be free to be the sort of person who just does whatever he feels like, and at the same time the sort of person who is capable of having meaningful relationships which require sacrifice. You can't be free to be the couch potato and the Olympic athlete. You have to pick which kind of freedom you want to go after. The drug addict with plenty of money and easy access to drugs, well, they're free in a certain kind of way, but it's not the freedom I want. There is a default mode of freedom, the freedom of our feelings, and there is a more intentional form of freedom, a freedom for excellence. The church, building upon Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle, has a long tradition of reflecting on what it takes to gain this sort of freedom. and tends to talk about it in terms of virtues. We might think of the virtues as being character qualities which dispose us towards behaving in a way which brings about excellence. Christian excellence is about being Christ-like, and being Christ-like is about living like Christ and also being prepared to sacrifice like Christ. In fact, one of my Dominican brothers once said, "The only life worth living is one worth dying for." The Christian life is about finding something worth dying for and then being free enough to do it. And that's way more demanding than what most people will ask of you. But it's also because the church thinks you are capable of so much more than what most people would ask of you. I don't mean that most people watching this video are likely to be literally martyred for being Catholic. I hope that's not the case. But if you're going to be a true Christian, you need to be the sort of person who can sacrifice even when it hurts. Christ came to live and to love, and because he would not compromise in truth or love, he would die for it. What would you die for, and what do you live for? Make sure it's for people, not things, for relationships, not for consumption. Because if you live your life for the sake of things less than love, then you're already a little dead. Some questions you might want to ask yourself: what do I worship? What do I love? What do I give my freedom, my attention to? And then I want you to step outside of yourself, so to speak, and consider, if somebody was to look at my life, listen to my conversations, hear my thoughts, scary prospect, I know, but the reality is God is doing that already. Sorry to break it to you. But if somebody else could see this, what would they think you worship? And so what does God know you worship? We need to ask these questions because the truest view of ourselves we can get is the God's eye view. And that requires stepping out of myself from time to time to look at the totality of my life and not just my thoughts at any given moment. Some of you might even find you're better than you think. It's also possible you might find the opposite. But at least you'll know, and at least you'll be living in reality. Because to be Christian is to live more in reality, not less. I want to talk now about your attention. It's very precious and I'm grateful to have it right now. Perhaps even a notification is popping up as I speak. Will you stay with me? Can it wait? Lots of people will compete for your attention because it's so precious. And what you give your attention to will tell you a great deal about you. And I want to suggest that you'll be able to tell a lot about what you worship, a lot about who you love, by what you give your attention to. Teachers and parents tell us, pay attention. And there's something in that because attention costs us something. Being truly attentive to someone requires not checking my phone, requires being able to take the cost of missing out on something else for the sake of someone present to me, making a genuine gift of myself to that person, which is a nice little wordplay on being truly present as making a gift of yourself. Your presence can be a present. Being able to choose to give your attention to something is a particularly human quality. Other animals don't have it, or at least don't have it to nearly the same degree. Your cat isn't deliberately ignoring you, it just doesn't want anything right now. And your dog couldn't ignore you, no matter how hard he or she tried. And I remember a man when I was in a park in Italy, and he was walking his dog and he was on his phone. He had a tennis ball in the hand, and being Italian was gesticulating wildly whilst on a phone call. A phone call could have been a feud with his lifelong enemy, or he could have been talking about picking up the dry cleaning. Both seemed to require a lot of waving hands in Rome. But whatever it was, he wasn't paying attention to his dog. But the dog was paying attention to the tennis ball in his hand, going up and down, and it was going on for some time, and the poor dog was jumping this way and that way, potentially the ball about to be thrown, and it just wasn't in its dog-like capacity to ignore it. But you can ignore me right now, or you could be thinking, I wish I was somewhere else. You could be thinking, I wonder what it's for dinner. Or you can decide to pay attention and think, there might be something in this. Or you might choose to reflect on a passage of scripture you heard on another video. All those options are on the table, and what we give our attention to is a value judgment and tells us something about us. Confronted by the Bible on a table and a copy of Cosmo or Vogue or Reader's Digest, or whatever else they might leave in waiting rooms these days, what you pick up to read says something about you and your priorities. Think Cosmo is better than the Bible, then I'd advise you to think again. Think the Bible is better and still pick up Cosmo or Reader's Digest, and it might show you that you prioritize entertainment and a quick fix over slow burning truth. What I want to focus though on is the ability to be attentive as a prerequisite of love. Simone Weil wrote, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." We cannot love something without paying it attention. We cannot love a person without making an effort to be truly with them. There's a nice little interchange about attention in the excellent film Lady Bird, a great film about relationships and coming to terms with who you are. Christine, the lead character, who goes by the name she's given herself of Lady Bird, has written a college application essay, and she's discussing it with a nun at the school. And in contrast to what Lady Bird has maintained throughout the film, Sister Sarah Joan tells her, "You clearly love Sacramento." And surprised, Lady Bird responds, "I do?" "Well," Sister Sarah Joan says, "you write about Sacramento so affectionately and with such care." "I was just describing it," Lady Bird says, brushing it off. "Well, it comes across as love," Sister Sarah Joan insists. "Sure," Lady Bird says, "I guess I pay attention." To which Sister Sarah Joan replies, "Don't you think maybe they are the same thing, love and attention?" When asked what the greatest commandment is, Jesus speaks about love. But he doesn't just tell us to love. He says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." I want to say something about the second commandment first. Notice he says, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself." And if you don't love yourself well, then loving your neighbor as you love yourself isn't going to be much use to the neighbor. Perhaps you don't think about it much, but the love you have for yourself is going to have a direct bearing on the sort of friend you are to others. Becoming holier, becoming more Christ-like will make you a better friend. And loving yourself is first and foremost about becoming holier. It's not about self-care, even though that has its place. Loving yourself is a response to God's love. It's seeing yourself as God sees you, which is worth dying for, and then recognizing that you are not trivial, but full of meaning. Because God is omnipotent and omniscient, when he died on the cross, he knew in his mind all the people he would die for. He knew you personally, and he did not die for an abstract idea of humanity. He knew you and died for you. And that's about the most remarkable thing anyone could ever realize. And a person who would die for me, that's the sort of person I want to serve and to know. It's the love of Christ that transforms, and the recognition of who he is and what he's done for me. It's the actions of Christ's life that let me know he is a king worthy of the name. He is the one true king and worthy of my love. But you can't force love. Phil Collins and Diana Ross also sang "You Can't Hurry It," and that's true too. That'll date you and me if you're getting that reference. But the kingdom of God has love as its supreme rule. And the love is both an invitation and a response. God invites us into his kingdom. He does not make us subject to it as a tyrant. Perhaps we've been far from the church and we've tried living in ways that are not God's ways, and we've seen these do not give us life. But God wants us to love his law, and he wants it to rule us, but not to rule us out of fear, but out of love. A rule that does more than command our obedience, but which transforms our intellect, our will, and our passions, all of us. We only freely love what we think is good. And so to love God completely with all our heart, all our mind, all our soul, is to love with all of ourselves and to see clearly what is good, and then to be free enough to give myself to it. We're only free when we see well and choose well. Being Christian, loving as a Christian, is not just about having a strong will. It's about seeing differently, desiring differently, and doing differently. And if you see a priest for confession or somebody for spiritual direction and you have some recurring sin and their recurring response is to tell you to try harder, well, at least in confession your sins are definitely forgiven. But it's not great advice, and I'd advise trying to see someone else. Because part of loving is knowing, and you cannot love what you do not know. And so part of loving myself is also having some self-knowledge, understanding why I do what I do. And so again, if I'm going to love myself well, so that I can respond to the Father's love, so that I can share this love with my neighbor, I need to know myself better and understand why I do what I do, and to begin to understand that difficulty which St. Paul points to. The good that I wish to do, I do not do, and I do that which I do not wish to do. And one thing we don't hear much about in homilies is the passions or the emotions. In fact, we might often hear them spoken about in a negative way. We might be reminded that love is not a feeling. But in fact, your feelings are really important. Your emotions are really important because they're powerful. And if you don't get them in order, you'll never possess yourself fully enough to be able to love anyone else well. And so here I want to give you a little bit of the moral psychology of St. Thomas Aquinas, who gets that our emotions are a crucial part of the moral life, who recognizes that to give and to be joyful, to delight in it, is so much better than to be a miserable giver. Now he speaks of two general sets of emotions or passions. The Latin word passio is passive, like it gets at the fact that the emotions are passive and they sort of happen to us rather than being something which we always choose. And the first set of emotions or passions he calls the concupiscible passions. And we might think of these concupiscible emotions as gut reactions to things. We don't choose to react that way. The reaction just happens. For example, I see a steak and I want it. I don't have to deliberate about wanting it, although I might have to deliberate about eating it if it's a Friday or if it's on somebody else's plate. But the basic pattern of the concupiscible emotions, the gut reactions, goes something like this. I sense something which I perceive as good. It may in fact not actually be good, which is why we have to train our emotions. But simply because I perceive it as good, I love it. And because I love it, I desire it. And when I have it, I experience pleasure. Love, desire, pleasure in union with it. Love, desire, and pleasure is crucial in the thought of Aquinas as being the basic dynamic of human action. And it's this pattern that drives almost everything that we do. But there's also a reverse equivalent. And in reverse, if I see something bad, like a Brussels sprout where I thought my steak should be, I try to avoid it. And if I'm two and I can't avoid it because I'm being forced by my mother who's currently shoving a fork into my face and forcing me to eat it, then I eat it, but I experience it as evil, and so I feel sad. And so we see the opposite of love, desire, and pleasure is hating the bad thing, trying to get away from the bad thing, and then sadness if in union with the bad things. And in all the emotions, there's both a bodily reaction and my awareness of it. I may be salivating at the steak, but I'm not just salivating, I'm aware of wanting it too. And so it's not just a bodily reaction, and it's not just in my head, it's both. And in the same way, when I feel fear, I'm aware of my heart pounding, my palms getting clammy, and I'm aware of being afraid of some danger. The next set of emotions Aquinas talks about are the irascible emotions, and these are like the gut reactions, but in a second order sense. They're at one remove, and we might call them the daring emotions. They relate to the same objects, the good and the bad, but they relate to them insofar as there's some difficulty in getting the good thing or some difficulty in avoiding the bad thing. So if I sense a good thing, but it's hard to get, for example, there's an obstacle between me and the good thing. Say, for example, I see the steak on the table and it's still looking good, but between me and it, leashed to the table, there's an aggressive looking dog. I can have two reactions. I can have hope and think, yes, that dog looks vicious, but I reckon I can get round it. Or I see that it's napping right now, and I think I'll do a quick snatch and run. Or on the other hand, I might despair, and I might think I'll never be able to get past the dog and give up. And so we've got the emotions of hope and despair in the face of a difficult good. But what if I now notice that the person who tied the leash to the table hadn't been paying enough attention at scouts or guides, and now this big snarling dog is no longer just an obstacle to the steak, but is now coming at me. The dog is now a danger, i.e. a difficult, bad thing. Here too, there are two ways I can react. I can be afraid, fearful, I might freeze or I might start to run, or I can be daring and brave and try and stare or shout down the dog or even take it on. So fear and daring are two emotions in the face of a difficult, bad thing. And there might be a bit of both going on, but our character will determine which dominates. Another example of fear and daring which gets closer to everyday life, there haven't been that many dogs between me and dinner of late. But say Steve is petrified of public speaking because when he was a child, he was on the stage in a play and he slipped and he fell and everyone laughed and the memory haunts him. And then whenever he thinks of public speaking, he thinks of that day and he thinks of the humiliation and the hurt of the laughter. Public speaking for Steve has now become an object of danger. Even the very thought of it seems dangerous and causes a reaction of fear. But say his boss has just walked in and he's been invited to give a presentation at work about an issue he's passionate about. Well, immediately the heart pounds, but will his reaction be despair or fear? Does he decline instinctively? Or will it be hope and daring and he accepts even though he thinks it will be really tough? In this example, we can also see how memory can enter into our emotions or passions. We can see how sometimes we need to heal our bad memories. And for Aquinas, understanding the emotions, as I said, is absolutely crucial to our learning to shape and form our emotions. Because our emotions, whilst not thought through, are not inevitable and hardwired reactions that we have to live with just as they are for the rest of our lives. We can consider what a passion or emotion is relating to in order to gain some control over the emotion. And most importantly, we can bring our reason to bear upon them. We can recognize that we always react this way, but we can also ask, is this a good reaction? So for example, in any given situation where I experience fear, I can think, what does the fear actually relate to? What actually is the loss that might occur in this situation? What is the real danger? Is there even one? And I can also think about what this fear is stopping me from doing. What is the good that I am choosing not to pursue in this situation because of my fear? And then I can think, am I giving up on something which is really good for the sake of preserving something which is of less value? Now perhaps all of this sounds rather obvious, and in a sense it is, Because courage, which is the virtue I want to talk about in relation to things that cause fear, courage is about reason in the face of difficulty. And hopefully in the abstract, all this has been very reasonable. But obviously in the heat of the moment, we experience it differently. And that's why it's really important to step back from time to time and think about how we're behaving when we have a calm head. Look at the circumstances in which we're bold and courageous and the circumstances in which we shrink back from difficulty. And this will tell us a little bit about what we really prioritize, not just in our heads, but in our hearts, in the lived reality of our lives. And what we might find is that what we prioritize is not actually what I want to prioritize. Looking at our emotions, realizing the ways that I cope with sorrow, the good ways that I use to pick myself up, and the bad ways helps me to know myself. And it's very often the case that the cause of a sin is not what we think it is. People who struggle with weight, it's rarely because they're greedy and a glutton, but because food is helping with some other sorrow. And we need to use our reason to address what that is. And in my experience, people who use pornography do it just as often because of boredom and frustration than they do because of lust. Again, they have to find a better and more reasonable way of dealing with the negative emotions that pornography is a really unhelpful emotional response to. Because I don't think many people are looking at pornography or overeating because they think it's a good thing, but still they find themselves doing it. And I want to close with one really practical suggestion as to how you might grow in the virtue of courage, which you might find this suggestion appalling, but it can actually be fun. And it's a practical exercise, because whilst we can learn something about courage from listening to a talk about it, the only way we really grow in it is by engaging in acts of courage. And I'm going to suggest something that goes by the horrendous title of rejection therapy. It involves recognizing that fear holds me back from doing things which are good, and that often this fear relates to the fear of being rejected, a fear of social death, so to speak, rather than actual death, a fear of asking for pay rise, a fear of speaking up about my faith in the workplace, a fear of being shunned for speaking a certain truth because I'm scared about an argument, a fear about standing out by speaking up for someone who needs support. And so what this therapy involves is deliberately getting rejected. You can decide to do it every day or once a week, and I'd suggest doing it with a friend or colleague. But what you do is decide to ask for something not immoral, but which more than likely the answer to which will be no. You are aiming to get rejected. The aim is not to be clever in the way that you ask for it so that you actually do get it, but to be bold in asking for it even though you expect to be rejected. And if you want ideas on some of the things you might do, there's a fun video on YouTube with a man called Jia Zhang. And the first day he asks a stranger to borrow $100. The next day he eats in a Five Guys, eats his burger, and then asks if he can have a free burger refill. The third day he asks at Krispy Kreme donuts if they'll make him donuts in the shape of Olympic rings. But watch the first 3 days and then think about whether you might do something similar yourself. Be bold, less fearful, and it might just change your life in things that are more important than a free burger refill. It might help you get over the fear that stops you from saying yes to Christ, not just in your head, but also in your heart and your soul. Father Miguel Pro loved the Lord his God with all his heart, all his mind, all his soul. Father Miguel, in celebrating the Mass, praying over the scriptures, had his fears of death transformed so that he no longer feared death, but only separation from true life in Christ. And I want to pray for all of you today that you let the Lord into your lives, that you let him become Lord of all of you, not just your Sunday, not just the moments of prayer, but you let him transform your emotions, all your thinking, that you let him into the vulnerable places in your life, the places of pain, the places of fear, so that he can bring his healing and his love to all of you. And then you may find true joy, true solace, true comfort in calling him, like St. Thomas, my Lord and my God.
So thank you, Father Toby, for that fascinating talk. There is so much to think about. Now, in previous seasons, we've heard testimony from different people, but as you may have realised, this time we are taking a slightly different approach. We wanted to give our speakers longer to expand on the themes with opportunities to pause and to reflect throughout, which means now it's over to you. Why not use the resources available on our website, abdiocese.org.uk/invited, to dive more deeply into what we've discussed today. I look forward to seeing you next week, when we will be joined by Father Kieran O'Brien, and he will be exploring some of the challenges that we face today. I'll see you then.
Come to the Father, come one and all. You are invited, so take up the call. His mercy can cover what's gone before. So come as you are.